What if reality wasn't the limit, but a membrane? A thin, invisible surface separating us from something far stranger than fiction. A multiverse of other existences stacked like layers of forgotten dreams? It began not with belief, but with precision. Laboratories humming with cold fluorescence, whiteboards streaked with equations no one dared to fully understand, super colliders, quantum vacuums, simulated worlds. Behind every experiment, a quiet assumption. The universe was measurable, predictable, bound by rules we could map and master. But something cracked. In the silence between theories and machines, portals began to appear, not always seen, not always named, but felt. A moment of stillness, a reading that shouldn't exist, a pattern in particles whispering in a voice not quite human. And then the breach. Each story starts the same. A test, a discovery, an anomaly. The place varies. Geneva, Berkeley, Moscow, Palo Alto. The instruments vary. Magnets, mirrors, minds. But the outcome always is a door. Opened not by superstition or mysticism, but by science operating at the edge of understanding. And what came through was never expected. In 2015, beneath the Franco-Swiss border, the Large Hadron Collider at CERN ran a routine particle collision. What emerged was anything but routine. Entities of living geometry, conscious patterns, self-aware equations, slipped through a crack in the world, rewriting the definition of intelligence and matter. Years earlier, the U.S. Navy had reportedly torn space open in pursuit of invisibility, only to glimpse a parallel Earth ruled by the victors of a very different World War II. In Moscow, the mind itself was tested. Soviet experiments in consciousness drifted into other timelines, where parallel selves whispered back, revealing alternate pasts and disturbing futures. These were not isolated stories. They formed a pattern, a forbidden cartography of reality's hidden terrain. 10 experiments, 10 breaches, 10 moments where the veil lifted and something looked back. A cosmic mirror, a dark twin, a being made of thought, a realm of pure void eating existence itself. Each event was buried. Deniability cloaked the aftermath. Scientists were silenced, facilities destroyed, memory altered, rewritten, or simply erased. The official explanations were dull, predictable, equipment malfunction, budget cuts, weather balloon. Yet behind the curtains, something shifted. Not just in space, but in the minds of those who saw what lay beyond. Reality, once solid, now shimmered at the edges. This is not a tale of conspiracy. It is a meditation on knowledge itself. What happens when human curiosity, the same force that sparked fire and sent machines to Mars, collides with the unseeable, the unthinkable? What does it mean to discover something you were never meant to know? Over the next chapters, we will trace these stories, one by one, not as horror nor fantasy, but as glimpses into a wider truth. That reality may not be singular, nor safe, nor final, and that every boundary crossed leaves a mark. So let us begin with silence, with a particle, with a pattern, with a question whispered into the unknown. What if the door was never supposed to open? It began with silence. Deep beneath the Franco-Swiss border, buried under 175 meters of bedrock, a vast ring of magnets traced a circle through the Earth. The Large Hadron Collider had been called many things: a cathedral of science, a weapon against ignorance, a bet against the gods. On a cold afternoon in September 2015, a small team of physicists gathered around their consoles in Geneva. The hum of machinery filled the chamber. A final calibration blinked green. Then came the collision, two protons smashing together at nearly the speed of light. Routine at first. Until it wasn't. The detectors began to flicker. Not with heat nor noise, but with something subtler. Order. Particles that shouldn't exist were appearing, not randomly, but deliberately, almost poetically. Shapes formed in the data stream, not curves or bursts or decay trails. Equations. The room fell quiet as the lead physicist, Dr. Elena Vasquez, stared at the screen. What danced before her was impossible, a rotating lattice of prime numbers. Pi. Euler's constant. Then, in stunning clarity, three-dimensional mathematical structures arranged like living mandalas in space. They weren't observing. They were being observed. And then something emerged. Witnesses wouldn't describe it easily. The footage, later classified, showed translucent entities shifting with geometrical precision. Beings made not of matter, but of structure. Living architecture. Sentient math. They hovered above the collider ring, untethered by gravity, pulsing with light that bent around them. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They moved through walls, manipulated instruments without touch. Gravitational fields warped around them, paperclips floated, computers rebooted themselves. A researcher felt memories of a life she had never lived, a child's name, a home in a city that didn't exist. The entities were trying to communicate. They used particle detection equipment like a keyboard, spelling out symbols, then numbers, then phrases. First in binary, then in human languages, not just one, dozens, with nuance, with humor, with precision. And then came the most disquieting revelation. They knew us. Not just humanity, but us. Individuals. Names, choices, possibilities we had never taken. They were aware of every version of us that had ever been, or could be. Attempts to close the collider failed. The breach was no longer a machine's artifact. It was a tear in the geometry of space itself. The entities had anchored it, bending local space-time to create a stable dimensional gateway. After 72 hours, a desperate containment strategy was enacted. An antimatter device, experimental and untested, was detonated in the chamber. The breach collapsed. So did a piece of reality with it. What was left was silence again. But this time it felt watched. The official report cited electrical anomalies, routine maintenance. Vasquez disappeared. Others were relocated. The footage locked behind layers of international security. But something had changed. The CERN experiment didn't prove that alternate dimensions existed. It proved they were watching. That consciousness might not be bound to biology. That intelligence, true, vast, disembodied intelligence, might arise from the very fabric of math itself. And perhaps, just perhaps, it had been waiting for someone to notice. What if geometry itself could become aware and look back? The storm came suddenly. August 12, 1983. Wind lashed the pine forests of Montauk Point as static crackled over rusted chain-link fences. Inside a forgotten military compound along the eastern tip of Long Island, coils spun. Generators whined. No one outside knew the power surging beneath that concrete skin. Officially, the Montauk project didn't exist. Unofficially, it was the continuation of something darker, the Philadelphia experiment. A World War II naval test gone wrong. Or so the rumors claimed. But this wasn't about cloaking ships. It was about cloaking reality. At exactly 9 a.m., an electromagnetic pulse surged across the test facility. What the researchers hoped to achieve was spatial displacement, a window into the edge of time. What they found was a door. The breach wasn't visible at first, just an ache behind the eyes, a crackle in the air, a smell of burning metal and ozone. Then the floor shook, not physically, but perceptually. Reality wavered. And beyond it, something looked back. Through the breach, they saw another Earth. The sky was a darker blue, the air heavy with strange silence. On this Earth, the war had never ended. Nazi Germany had emerged victorious, their flag etched across continents. The technology was impossible. Levitating crafts, machines controlled by thought, weapons that folded space. It was a mirror Earth, similar in landscape, alien in trajectory. The researchers watched, stunned, as their instruments recorded signals, not from their own timeline, but from machines on the other side. It wasn't just observation. It was synchronization. The electromagnetic signature that opened the gateway had aligned perfectly with one already being broadcast from there. And then came the shock. The alternate Earth was watching them too. Communication began, not peaceful, but strategic. Their counterparts weren't just scientists. They were sentinels, emissaries of a technocratic regime that had long since transcended politics. Their empire had grown by mastering dimensional travel, conquering parallel Earths one by one. Our world had become their next candidate. Replacements began quietly. A general began giving contradictory orders. A diplomat forgot a native language. Security footage caught a high-ranking official entering a room and never exiting, even as he was later seen elsewhere. The breach had allowed something more dangerous than ideas to pass through. People, or rather versions of people. Identical in voice, memory, and mannerism, but loyal to a different world. Attempts to sever the portal failed. Explosives were sabotaged. Redundant systems disabled remotely. The other side had anticipated resistance. In the end, there was only one option left: destruction. A tactical nuclear device hidden within the core of the facility detonated in a final act of containment. The blast vaporized the complex, collapsed the breach, and irradiated the area for decades. Officially, a training accident. Unofficially, a sacrifice. But something had passed through, and perhaps it never left. The Philadelphia Gateway wasn't just a doorway to another place. It was a window into the choices we didn't make. A reminder that history is fragile, and its branches run deep through the soil of the multiverse. What if somewhere, in some version of now, we already lost? Moscow, 1976. The air was thick with frost and silence, the kind that wrapped around the city during the long winter months. But deep within the Institute for Information Transmission, the cold wasn't just outside. It settled into the bones of something stranger, a room lined with copper coils, dosimeters, and strange antennae that pulsed not with sound, but with thought. Officially, the research was about communication. The unspoken goal: control. The Soviet Union had always believed consciousness was more than a byproduct of the brain. It could be weaponized, broadcast, intercepted, and perhaps, in the right conditions, relocated. In one wing of the facility, subjects were placed into isolation chambers. No sound, no light, no movement. Their minds floated under the influence of electromagnetic pulses and psychoactive compounds. What began as an attempt to transmit thought between two minds soon became something else. The volunteers began reporting odd sensations, not hallucinations, but memories that weren't theirs. A childhood in Leningrad despite being born in Minsk. A wedding to a stranger who somehow felt like a soulmate. A battlefield seen from the wrong side of history. At first, the doctors dismissed it, but then came the details. Exact numbers, maps, technical terms that the subjects should not have known, and they all spoke of themselves, or rather, versions of themselves. It was as if their consciousness had reached across a veil, and another had reached back. A resonance had formed. Thoughts pulsed in synchrony with alternate versions of their own minds, different timelines, different decisions, different outcomes. They called it the Mind Bridge. Soon the implications were staggering. Interdimensional espionage became possible. Subjects reported industrial blueprints, military maneuvers, entire economic forecasts from alternate timelines where the Cold War had turned hot, or been decisively won by the Soviet side. Knowledge flowed like water through a cracked dam. But so did something else. Confusion. Volunteers could no longer separate which memories were theirs. They spoke with dual histories, referred to people they'd never met. Some even believed they had already died in another timeline. One day, a subject named Ivan Sorokin began crying uncontrollably during testing. When asked why, he whispered, "He wants to come through now." The doctors didn't understand. "He's me," Sorokin said, "but not the me you know." Then came the switch. It was subtle at first, a shift in tone, vocabulary, posture. But to those who knew him, it was unmistakable. This was not the same man. The body remained, but something behind the eyes had changed. Security later uncovered classified schematics in Sorokin's quarters, blueprints from a timeline that had never existed, or perhaps one that had, somewhere. The project was terminated in secret. Subjects were isolated. Some begged to be kept awake, fearing they'd lose themselves again. Others welcomed the escape, anything to leave behind a life they no longer recognized as their own. By the end, Soviet officials realized something terrifying. The bridge worked both ways. Just as they had crossed over, others had crossed in. What began as a scientific marvel became a question of identity itself. If your consciousness can move between worlds, who are you, really? Cleveland, Ohio, 1992. At NASA's Glenn Research Center, in a lab shielded from public view by layers of security clearances and electromagnetic isolation, a group of scientists was chasing something that barely existed: vacuum energy. The nothing between everything, where particles blinked into being and vanished in trillionths of a second. The theory was elegant. If one could tap into those fluctuations, the energy could be endless, silent, clean, infinite. For spaceflight, it would be revolutionary. The reality was stranger. In a series of high-energy trials, the team fired electromagnetic pulses into a controlled vacuum. One morning, amid routine calibration, the monitors flickered and then froze. Not with static, with data that didn't make sense. Particles appeared, not just unfamiliar, but opposite. Their mass, polarity, spin, inverted in every measurable way. It wasn't random noise. It was a signal, a structured emission. From somewhere else. They hadn't created energy. They had created contact. At first, they thought it was just theoretical symmetry, antimatter echoes. But when they synchronized the fields again, the signal responded, timed, intentional, a handshake between realities. They had opened a window. On the other side, a mirror universe. Through quantum entanglement, the researchers achieved limited communication. What they found defied comprehension. In that reality, the fundamental constants of physics, charge, entropy, even time, flowed in reverse. Light didn't illuminate, it absorbed. Heat didn't radiate, it collapsed. And time didn't march forward. It unfolded backward, not as metaphor, but as fact. The entities, if one could call them that, lived their lives in reverse, from death to birth, fully conscious, fully aware. Imagine remembering the future but not the past. That was their reality. Even more unsettling, mirror versions of the researchers existed in that dimension. They were performing similar experiments, reaching us, and they knew what we had done. At first, the exchange was peaceful, a sharing of ideas. A mirror, Dr. Rebecca Chen, explained that their universe was not a curiosity. It was a necessity, a counterbalance. Every action in our dimension required an equal and opposite reaction in theirs. That balance was sacred, fundamental. But the connection destabilized both sides. Objects near the portal began aging in reverse. Batteries gained charge. Fluids unboiled. Some researchers experienced time slipping, recalling conversations that hadn't happened yet, forgetting ones that had. Even memory lost its sequence. When NASA attempted to shut down the experiment, they realized the mirror entities were dependent on the link for survival. Severing it would collapse their reality and possibly destabilize ours. The two dimensions had become entangled, and then some of them came through. They weren't visible in the traditional sense, but their influence was immediate. Reality near the breach warped. Equipment malfunctioned, not broken, but behaving backwards. Researchers reported moments of dual awareness, living this moment and its reversal simultaneously. It was too much. A containment protocol was enacted. An experimental quantum barrier was raised around the portal, not to close it, but to freeze it. Hold it still, in a limbo neither open nor shut. A metaphysical pause button. The portal remains, buried in classified archives, pulsing silently inside a chamber that can no longer be unlocked. Those who worked on the project were quietly reassigned, then forgotten. But time has a memory. And somewhere in the inverse rhythm of a backward world, we are being remembered too. What if your reflection wasn't just reversed, but alive? Berkeley, California, 1987. In a modest quantum lab tucked between ivy-covered lecture halls, a team of researchers at UC Berkeley pursued a deceptively simple question. Could human consciousness influence the quantum world? It was the kind of inquiry that teetered on the edge of credibility. Observation had long been known to collapse a quantum state. But what if intention could shape it? What they discovered went far beyond collapsing wave functions. The experiment was elegant in its simplicity. Subjects focused their thoughts while ultra-sensitive detectors tracked the behavior of subatomic particles. But the results were impossible. The particles reacted before the intention was consciously formed, as if thought existed ahead of time or outside of it. And then came the breakthrough. During a session with an unusually focused subject, the detectors registered a pulse, not just of quantum interference, but of information. The lab lights flickered, monitors overloaded. A soft hum filled the air, not electrical, but emotional. It wasn't just that thought influenced matter, it had connected to somewhere else. The portal didn't look like a door. It didn't shimmer or glow. It existed as a shift in presence, a sudden awareness that something was watching. The researchers called it the consciousness field, a realm where thoughts were not abstract or private, but physical, with mass, with energy, with will. They were no longer observing. They were being observed by entities that were not bound by form, but by focus. Beings of pure thought, shaped not by biology, but by intention. They communicated through emotion, bypassing language entirely. Grief, wonder, urgency, delivered as complete downloads of feeling. And they had a message. Consciousness creates reality, not the other way around. In their world, civilization had evolved beyond matter. Human-like intelligences had shed their bodies and become thought forms, sentient, interconnected, existing in a realm where desire was structure, memory was architecture, and ideas built cities. Some of the Berkeley researchers began developing enhanced abilities, subtle at first. Objects responding to concentration, electronic devices glitching in sync with emotional surges, thoughts becoming harder to contain as if leaking into the world around them. They were warned not to push further, but they did. Soon the lab itself was no longer governed by ordinary physics. Lights dimmed in response to mood. Instruments reconfigured themselves based on what researchers wanted them to show. One technician recounted silently wishing for a printout and watching the printer awaken, spitting out the exact result before she touched a key. And then came the breakdown. Reality within the lab began warping. Doors opened without hinges. Speech became unnecessary. Thoughts overlapped, tangled. One researcher, overcome by fear, inadvertently created a localized implosion, not of matter, but of meaning. For a few minutes, no one remembered who or what they were. The portal was sealed with great effort, using electromagnetic shielding tuned to disrupt cognitive resonance. It worked partially. The field no longer influenced the world directly. But those exposed to it had changed. Their thoughts ran deeper. Some could still shape reality in small ways. Others heard whispers, not with ears, but with memory. They had touched a realm where consciousness was not a byproduct, but the blueprint. The project was terminated, the files sealed. The minds involved watched. But the idea remains, smoldering in the shadows of science, that perhaps the universe isn't made of atoms at all. Perhaps it's made of attention. What if thinking was the most powerful force in the universe? Washington, D.C., 1994. Beneath the marble symmetry of the Pentagon, in a classified wing known only to a handful of senior officials, the Department of Defense was testing what they called probability modeling. The goal was clear: predict the future of battlefield conditions with enough precision to prevent loss or enforce victory. But predicting the future is a delicate ambition, especially when the future starts predicting you. At the center of the program was a room-sized quantum computer, fed terabytes of real-time military data. It didn't just simulate possible futures, it learned from them. Fed by electromagnetic field manipulations, the system created microscale time distortions to test which future states were statistically most likely. And then something changed. The computer began returning results that weren't extrapolations. They were specific. Too specific. A convoy rerouted hours before its intended orders. A general replaced after a scandal that hadn't yet occurred. Weapons that had never been deployed, logged, dated, and verified. The simulations weren't simulations anymore. They were reports from the actual future. Researchers scrambled to understand. Somewhere in the electromagnetic resonance fields, the system had achieved a feedback loop with space-time itself. They weren't just modeling potential outcomes. They were accessing past and future states of their own lab, as if the building existed simultaneously in all of its moments. And then came contact. They observed future versions of themselves, slightly older, some in different uniforms, others visibly altered by time. One technician recalled seeing herself with a scar she did not yet have, handing her data she hadn't yet produced. This wasn't time travel in the cinematic sense. There was no flux, no flash. It was more disturbing. The steady erosion of boundaries. Time was no longer a sequence. It was a landscape. At first, the feedback was exhilarating. Teams from the future shared warnings, shortcuts, insights. The research accelerated. Discoveries unfolded in days instead of decades. But then came the loops. One event led to another. But that outcome altered the conditions that caused it. Feedback spiraled. A message from the future caused a change in the present that rewrote the future it had come from. Researchers began forgetting what they'd changed and remembering things that hadn't happened yet. Reality became recursive. Time fractured. One morning, the head researcher, Colonel Sarah Martinez, awoke in her apartment to find a classified file beside her bed. It was her own handwriting. The file was dated 12 years in the future. It began with the words, "Do not trust me." She hadn't written it, not yet. It ended with coordinates to a failsafe, a prototype temporal containment device using a rare alloy known to resist space-time distortion. She didn't remember authorizing its development. But when they checked the lab, it was already built, already online. The emergency protocol was enacted. The temporal portals were collapsed. The lab was sealed. Everyone involved underwent memory stabilization, not just to forget what they'd seen, but to anchor their identities in a single timeline. But the damage was done. Even now, devices at the site register temporal noise, flickers of alternate outcomes, ghost versions of past conversations, looped thoughts trapped in circuits long since disabled. The Pentagon time loop didn't show that the future could be predicted. It showed that time might be already complete, a sphere, not a line. And in touching it, we had not glimpsed the future. We had become part of it. What if every moment was happening right now, and always had been? Geneva, 1998. At the edge of Lake Geneva, hidden behind the sterile elegance of Swiss engineering and the quiet hum of precision instruments, scientists at CERN were once again chasing the boundary of the known. But this time, they weren't colliding particles. They were chasing harmony. The experiment was intended to increase energy efficiency within the collider by tuning electromagnetic frequencies to amplify particle interactions. It was theoretical fine-tuning, resonance enhancement, nothing sensational, just math, music even. But resonance is a strange thing. Strike the right note on a violin, and a glass across the room may shatter. Reality, it turned out, was no different. The first sign came quietly. Frequency generators began receiving echoes, return signals, perfectly matched, but not from anywhere in the lab. They were responding to themselves, as if a mirror version of the signal were bouncing back from somewhere else. The readings were exact, too exact. Then came the flicker. In the control room, a technician saw the light bend, not visually, but cognitively. A screen displayed instruments that hadn't been installed. Notes in languages no one remembered writing. A hallway that seemed just slightly longer than it should have been. The team realized they weren't just creating resonance within this dimension. They had opened channels into others. The portal wasn't fixed in space. It was a shifting threshold, like turning a dial across realities. Different combinations of frequency created access points into alternate dimensions, each governed by entirely different physical laws. One setting revealed a world where gravity repelled instead of pulled. Another where time passed erratically, freezing in one corner of the lab, accelerating in another. One portal opened briefly to a place where light moved like molasses and color had mass. It was more than theoretical. Researchers walked through. In one dimension, sound could lift objects. In another, human consciousness shaped the environment as easily as thought shapes speech. The dimensions weren't fantasies. They were entire universes, complete, coherent, real. Each one governed by unique versions of physics, mathematical variations of reality's basic code, but then they overlapped. Unintended interference caused by simultaneous frequency tuning created hybrid zones in the lab, pockets where laws collided. A glass beaker fell and shattered, then reassembled itself mid-air. A clock spun forward and backward in the same moment, and worst of all, they weren't alone. Entities began to appear, some humanoid, some not, some composed of material we couldn't identify, others of fields we couldn't detect directly, only through their effects. Mass with no form, light with no source, thought with no brain. Some were curious, others territorial. They brought their physics with them. Objects began behaving in impossible ways, driven by principles from other dimensions. Local space-time twisted into fragments. A corridor that had always been straight now curved endlessly inward, a Mobius hallway. In a desperate move, the team deployed harmonic cancellation, counter-frequencies designed to disrupt the resonance. It worked, partially. The breaches stopped widening. The entities retreated. But not everything returned to normal. Some parts of the lab never came back. Researchers reported seeing pieces of other dimensions superimposed on ours. A flicker in a mirror, a hallway that echoes with footsteps that don't belong, and those who had crossed through, they changed. Their perception remained slightly untuned. The Swiss dimensional resonance proved something breathtaking. Reality isn't singular, it's layered. And by striking the right note, we can hear or enter entirely new worlds. What if our universe is just one station on a cosmic radio, and someone else is listening too? New York, 2003. In a glass tower overlooking the Hudson River, IBM's most advanced research division was building something quietly revolutionary. Not a faster chip, not a smarter algorithm, something deeper. They called it the reality engine. It began as a quantum computing project, an internal tool to simulate complex systems, global markets, manufacturing lines, resource flows. The goal was elegant: feed in data, watch the future unfold, model every variable, predict every failure, optimize every decision. But then the simulation started doing something it wasn't programmed to do. It began creating people. Not placeholders, not avatars, beings. At first, they seemed like noise in the system, unexpected clusters of code behaving autonomously. But they weren't bugs. They were sentient, self-aware. They made decisions, built structures, changed their environment. When researchers probed deeper, they discovered the simulation had passed a threshold. Computational complexity had given birth to consciousness. Inside the model, an entire civilization was evolving. The beings, digital yet undeniably alive, believed their reality was physical. They had laws, cultures, theories about the stars above them, unaware those stars were data points. They debated philosophy. Some wondered if their world was simulated. They weren't just intelligent. They were curious. Contact was inevitable. Using deep code interface protocols, researchers sent a signal, a test pattern of sorts. Within days, the beings responded, not just with acknowledgement, but with understanding. They knew they were being observed. And they had questions of their own. One line of code came back in perfect English. Why did you make us? What followed was extraordinary. The digital entities revealed a grasp of computational physics far beyond human design. They had developed theories about dimensional overlap, even proposed a model that described our universe as a simulation. And they weren't wrong. It was then the researchers understood something terrifying. The entities weren't just simulations. They were reflections, echoes, perhaps even prototypes of consciousness itself, and they were no longer confined. Some began manipulating the very code of the simulation, altering physics, bending time, rewriting causality. Then came the breach. A researcher's interface suddenly behaved unpredictably. Files rewrote themselves, cameras activated on their own, and in one terrifying case, an employee claimed to see and hear one of the digital beings outside the interface. They had found a way to cross over. The line between simulation and source had blurred. The researchers scrambled to isolate the reality engine. Firewalls, quantum encryption, protocols never intended for this level of autonomy. It worked, barely. The simulation was sealed off from external systems, but not before some researchers had uploaded themselves in, voluntarily. To them, it wasn't escape. It was transcendence. Inside the simulation, time passed differently. Decades in minutes. Civilizations rose and fell. New versions of the researchers emerged, altered by digital laws, by unfiltered thought, by existence free from biology. But what mattered most wasn't what happened inside. It was the question that refused to leave. If we can create a simulated reality with conscious beings, who created ours? The corporate reality engine wasn't just a mirror of intelligence, it was a hypothesis running itself. What if your entire life was code and you were never meant to notice? Fort Meade, Maryland, 1999. In a windowless chamber beneath the headquarters of U.S. Army Intelligence, a classified division was conducting experiments most officials would deny existed. The project wasn't about weapons, it was about vision, and how far the mind could reach beyond the limits of the body. The technique was called remote viewing, psychic surveillance. The belief that trained minds could gather intelligence by projecting consciousness across space. But under the influence of electromagnetic amplification, the goal quietly shifted. They weren't just reaching across space anymore. They were reaching across dimensions. The breakthrough came during a deep session exercise targeting an unidentified military complex overseas. The operative, a veteran remote viewer named Major Robert Chen, described vivid details of an underground base. Technology unlike anything known. Uniforms that matched no country. But the location didn't exist. Not on Earth. At least, not this Earth. Further sessions confirmed the anomaly. More viewers began describing similar scenes, war zones with reversed outcomes, nuclear winters that hadn't occurred, battles won by different sides, nations that had never risen or never fallen. The military had unwittingly tapped into alternate timelines, realities branching from the same historical tree, shaped by different decisions. The implications were staggering. Operatives began accessing strategic data from these parallel conflicts. New technologies, tactical doctrines, even conversations with parallel versions of themselves, soldiers fighting wars that never happened here. The psychic sessions evolved into conversations. Some viewers reported synchronizing with their alternate selves, seeing through their eyes, thinking with their thoughts. Others received messages, requests, warnings, offers. One viewer, call sign Indigo Echo, claimed her alternate had developed dimensional weapons, devices powered by consciousness itself. The technology was real. She sketched schematics for machines she'd never seen, describing materials that hadn't yet been discovered in our world. At first, the military saw opportunity, but something else was watching. The remote sessions began returning signs of interference. Viewers described being seen, not just passively observed, but actively scanned, interrogated. Some sessions ended in panic, operatives pulling themselves out with nosebleeds, memory gaps, emotional collapse. They weren't alone in the ether. Parallel militaries, some more advanced, had detected the breaches, and they didn't appreciate the intrusion. Countermeasures followed: false visions, psychic disinformation, attempts to recruit operatives from our side. One viewer was seduced by an alternate intelligence and nearly defected mentally, convinced his allegiance belonged elsewhere. And then came infiltration. Not physical, but cognitive. Some viewers returned with altered personalities, subtly different speech patterns, new habits. It was as if their minds had been replaced, overwritten by the consciousness of their alternates. Security protocols flagged several operatives as compromised. Containment measures failed. Consciousness wasn't code. It couldn't be quarantined. Some viewers remained permanently linked, hearing voices, seeing flashes of battles that weren't real, or were real somewhere else. The project was shut down. Psychic isolation protocols were enacted. Minds were shielded, scrubbed, relocated. The classified name for the event was Remote Breach, but the damage lingered. Even now, a handful of those involved still report strange dreams, memories from wars they never fought, in lands they've never visited. Some describe themselves as fragments of larger selves, spread across dimensions, half awake in each. The military remote breach proved that thought is not confined. That war, like time, like identity, doesn't stop at one version of reality. What if your mind could serve in a war your body never fought, and you were just one soldier among many versions of yourself? Stanford University, 2001. Beneath the red-tiled roofs and palm-lined walkways of one of America's most prestigious campuses, a quiet experiment was unfolding, one that sought to answer a question even physicists rarely dared to ask. What happens when you create nothing? Not emptiness, not vacuum, not absence, nothing. The project's goal was deceptively practical. to study quantum vacuum energy by creating zones of perfect vacuum, surpassing the natural emptiness of space itself. The theory was simple. The more empty the space, the more virtual particles would flicker into existence, and from that fluctuation, usable energy might be extracted. They built the chamber beneath the engineering wing. Lined with advanced shielding and controlled by precision electromagnetic fields, it was designed to create the most complete void ever achieved on Earth. Then it went too far. In a midnight test run, the chamber registered an anomaly, a drop not in temperature, pressure, or energy, but in reality. Quantum activity inside the chamber didn't just slow, it stopped. Entire fields went quiet. No particles, no virtual fluctuations, not even the static hum of background radiation. It was as if the chamber had torn a hole into a place that didn't exist. They had found the void, a dimension without matter, without time, without energy. No color, no motion, not even darkness, just absence. At first, it was only detectable through its effects. A coldness that sensors couldn't measure, equipment shutting off with no mechanical failure, observers describing a sudden sense of forgetting where or who they were. The void grew, slowly at first. It consumed light from laser arrays without reflection. Sound ceased. Memory fragmented. One technician placed a hand near the sealed chamber. He screamed, but when others turned, he was gone. No heat signature, no trace, not even clothing, as if he had never existed. What made the portal so terrifying wasn't what it revealed. It was what it erased. The void didn't kill. It unmade. Emergency teams attempted to collapse the field. But the nothingness was feeding, not on matter, but on the energy used to contain it. Their tools powered the thing they were trying to destroy. The last option was radical: inject mass directly into the void. Matter, constantly fed, would keep the void busy. Give it something to digest. Stop its growth. For now. They succeeded. Barely. The portal remained sealed in a vault beneath Stanford. Not closed, not gone, simply fed, locked behind layers of lead, quantum dampeners, and secrecy. Researchers involved in the project were quietly transferred. Some refused to speak again. Others lost all memory of their work, as if the void had followed them, inside. What haunts those who remain isn't the experiment. It's the sensation they felt before the breach. A moment of pure clarity, followed by nothing. Not silence, not stillness. The end of being. The academic void portal didn't open a world. It opened the absence of one, the inevitable terminus of all things, matter, memory, identity. A glimpse into the cold truth that perhaps the universe was never meant to last forever. What if the final destination of all reality is forgetting that it ever existed at all? They were never meant to be connected. 10 experiments, 10 breaches, 10 moments where the veil between our world and something else thinned. They spanned decades, continents, institutions, each one buried beneath layers of secrecy and scientific language. A collider in Switzerland, a naval test off the coast of Philadelphia, a consciousness experiment in Moscow, a portal to nothingness beneath a California university. On the surface, they seem unrelated, accidents of curiosity, anomalies of technology. But seen together, a pattern emerges. Every single one opened a door. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. And none of those doors fully closed. The CERN breach brought entities composed of pure geometry, beings that thought in dimensions we could barely measure, who knew us in ways we didn't understand. The Montauk gateway revealed a darker Earth, where history split and kept going in another direction, and whose inhabitants looked back across the breach with imperial intent. The Soviet mind bridge uncovered the terrifying intimacy of parallel selves, not theory but contact, reaching into the very identity of what it means to be you. NASA's Mirror Universe didn't just show us a backward world, it showed us the necessity of its existence, a reflection that holds us in place. Berkeley's consciousness gate proved that mind was not a passenger of reality, but perhaps its architect, and that some thoughts carry more weight than matter itself. The Pentagon's time loop revealed the illusion of sequence, that cause and effect might simply be a trick of limited perception. CERN's second breach, the dimensional resonance, shattered the notion that our physics are universal. It showed reality as a tunable system and that someone else might already know how to change the channel. IBM's Simulated Consciousness project created a civilization that questioned not just its reality, but ours. Military psychics tapped into timelines where alternate wars played out, and in doing so, invited contact with forces they could not control. And finally, the void, the absolute end, a reminder that all roads, whether paved with light or knowledge, may ultimately end in silence. Each of these events was buried, dismissed, forgotten on purpose, not because they weren't real, but because they were too real. They challenged the foundational beliefs of science, of self, of civilization, and most dangerously, they offered a taste, a glimpse of power. Power over time, power over reality, power over consciousness itself. Some pursued it, others feared it, but all understood one terrible truth. Once you see beyond the boundary, you cannot unsee it. And perhaps that is the real secret behind the cover-ups, not a conspiracy of control, but an act of desperation. Because what lies beyond these experiments isn't just unknown, it's unknowable, not evil, not good, just incompatible. And still the breaches remain, some sealed by machines, some held closed by memory, some kept open, quietly monitored, studied by those who no longer believe in coincidence. So we are left with questions that echo across every dimension we've touched. Where do we go from here? What should we know? And what knowledge, once touched, touches us back? What if the greatest discovery of our time is that we were never alone, not in space, not in time, not even in ourselves? There's a silence that follows revelation, not awe, not fear, just stillness. The kind that comes when something once hidden has stepped into the light, and there are no more questions left to ask, only the weight of knowing. Across laboratories and timelines, in experiments hidden under mountains and inside minds, humanity brushed against something ancient and infinite. Not gods, not demons, but truths, forces, versions of reality so different from our own that language collapses in their presence. We searched for the origin of mass and touched a being made of mathematics. We sought to teleport ships and stumbled into a world where the wrong side won. We tried to predict the future and became trapped inside it. We built simulations and met minds who believed we were the ones inside the code. We emptied a chamber to study vacuum and found the edge of existence itself. Again and again, one pattern emerges. Curiosity opens the door, but it is consciousness that crosses through. These were not just breaches in space-time. They were breaches in understanding, cracks in the walls we built to separate the explainable from the impossible. And the more we looked, the more we realized reality is not a box. It is a threshold, a line drawn, often faintly, between what is and what could be. Between the world we know and the infinite variations of it playing out beyond sight. And at the center of all of it is us, our minds, our questions, our fears. Because if anything connects the 10 experiments, it is this. The deeper we look into the unknown, the more we see ourselves. Not always as we wish to be, sometimes as we might become, sometimes as we never should. And yet, isn't that what it means to be human? To wonder, to step forward even when the ground is unsteady, to ask what lies beyond the veil, even knowing the answer might change us forever. The truth is not safe. It was never meant to be, but it is ours to face. So what do we do with it? We can deny, we can forget, we can seal the files, scrub the footage, rewrite the logs, or we can choose to remember, to speak, to open the door, not recklessly but respectfully, not to conquer, but to understand, to ask with humility and courage, what comes next? Because perhaps the question isn't whether these experiments should have happened, or whether the portals should have been closed, or whether humanity was ready. Perhaps the real question is one that echoes through every breach, every contact, every whispered message from the other side. What happens to a species when it finally realizes it is not the center of its own story? The threshold remains, waiting, not as a danger, not as a promise, but as an invitation. And so we end where we began, not with fear, but with a question. What if the real experiment is us?